Good morning, everyone. We're still waiting on Senator Warner. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to continue to join. Good morning. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning, Milan. How are you?
Good. How are you? We are actually live and recording right now. I'm giving folks 2 more minutes to log on.
Okay, great.
All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started?
Great.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Milan Dalal. I'm on the board of the Democratic Business Council for Northern Virginia, also known as DemBiz. For those of you joining us for the first time, we're an organization based in Virginia dedicated to helping foster a dialogue between the Commonwealth's Democrats and the business community. If you like our programming, I encourage you to sign up after this session. A brief programming note. After Senator Warner provides opening remarks, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. You have a Q&A box in which you can type questions, and I will choose from them and mix in some that we've also received by email. Please list your name and where you're from. We don't like to get anonymous questions. So with that, I'll do a little intro of Senator Warner. This morning, we're fortunate enough to be joined by the senior senator from Virginia and former governor of the Commonwealth. Senator Warner is a perfect guest for DemBiz. As a former venture capitalist and successful businessman, he certainly knows the business world very well and its needs in politics and government. After a very successful term as governor, Senator Warner entered the Senate in 2009 and has been a bipartisan leader on virtually every major issue that's come before the Senate, serves on the banking, budget, finance, and intelligence committees. And on the latter committee, certainly has played a critical role in our national security as vice chairman of the Intelligence Committee and investigating the role that Russia has played in the election interference of 2016. On a personal note, I had the opportunity to work for Senator Warner for 4.5 years in the Senate. And so I've actually seen firsthand the bipartisan way in which he approaches every major problem and tries to find solutions for Virginians. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome my former boss and friend, Senator Mark Warner.
Well, thank you, Milan. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for years of friendship and working together. Looks like a pretty nice house you got there. I've never been over there yet, but it's like looks like a great venue for an event.
Well, when social distancing is over, you're welcome to come over.
All right. Well, thank you. Milan has done a great job, and he helped me on a whole host of issues when he served on our committee, served on my staff, and did a lot of the banking and finance and business related issues. It is great to see you again. And for Chris King and everybody involved with DemBiz, thank you for having me. This last time I spoke was to the group was when we were still meeting in person, and I want to apologize to the DemBiz members because I know last week I was supposed to appear, I think last Thursday, I believe it was. Like, these days all seem to run together. And that was the morning I had to postpone because the president had actually asked me to be part of his bipartisan reopening the economy group. And my preface on that was I would participate as long as whatever actions he was going to take were going to be data driven, driven by science. So I'm not sure how much longer my participation is going to last, and I'm not sure whether there's going to even be more meetings because the one call I was on, I didn't get a chance to ask a question. Interestingly enough, there were like, I think 12 Democratic senators, maybe 13, every Republican senator with the exception of Mitt Romney. So more than a little unusual on that note. I'd also, in terms of, as we think about this unusual time, I hope everybody who is Zooming on this call is healthy and safe. I mean, these are, again, extraordinary, extraordinary times. I will point out, I did release something this weekend in a counter to all of the elected officials who are, either singing a song or playing an instrument or, baking their grandmother's favorite chocolate chip recipe. I did my variation on that, not being exactly a high cuisine chef. I put together a video where I prepared my, my favorite recipe, the recipe my kid says is the only recipe I know, where I prepared a tuna melt, and we'll point that out for, it's only 2 minutes. I think your viewing enjoyment, pleasure, or just saying, Warner, you're looking so crazy doing that. So be that as it may, let me get to the issues at hand. We're still in this remarkable period, I believe, for the next 10 or 12, 14 days, where even though we've seen the numbers on a national basis seem to plateau a little bit, I think we're seeing three factors that are really raising the stress level for all of us. Unprecedented numbers of Americans, Virginians, going on unemployment, 22 million. I think the numbers this week will hopefully not be as bad as last week, but I do know every week that's going along, as I hear businesses saying, we've managed to keep people on for as long as we can, but we're going to have to lay off. So huge, huge numbers there. At the same time, huge stress as well around the so-called CARES package that we put together, which I don't believe is actually a $2.2 trillion package. I think it is more a $6 trillion package because there's $4 trillion of Federal Reserve level funding that comes out of this package that oftentimes doesn't get counted, but it's also there to help shore up the economy. And I think people ask, well, that sounds great. When am I going to get my money? And I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions on that, and we'll come back to it. And then third, I think there is this enormous challenge, as we've seen in Virginia. The numbers keep going up. The rate of increase may not be as much, but yesterday I think we had 500 new cases. I think today we had 4 something, but the numbers are still extraordinarily substantial. And some of the things that are coming due, no matter what the president does to try to foist blame, whether it be on the governors or foist blame on China or foist blame on WHO, his administration's response has been lackluster, to say the least. It still is amazing to me that why America didn't join with countries like Germany and South Korea and others around a more robust testing regime. I think we lost at least 60 days. I think it's still remarkable that we don't have any centralized testing site at this point where we can find county by county, state by state, how many tests, what are the test protocols, what are the test capabilities, as we have state tests, as we have, universities and others who've developed their own tests. And then we've got companies like Abbott and others and a series of other tests coming online antibody-wise. I've raised this issue with the vice president and not gotten much of a response. I'm not going to get ahead of myself in terms of announcements, but my hope is that there may be a university, I'm trying to work with Johns Hopkins on this, that may create this independent master site. If we have around testing, we should have much more transparency, much more clarity. A lot of good things are starting to happen, but the fact that we're still as much in the dark about that is, I think, a huge mistake by the administration. The other, and the area where there's even been worse actions, and that is on PPE, on the gowns, the masks, the equipments. The fact that the president has still never used the Defense Production Act, I think, is a real tragedy. And the fact that we have these communities pitted against each other, hospital system against hospital system, state against state, is extraordinarily an extraordinary mistake. And I think lives have been lost because we didn't get the appropriate equipment so that people, not only first responders in terms of healthcare, but also folks who work at the grocery store, pharmacy, delivery, they need to get this equipment as well. They're all on the front line, and we need to do more. And we should have been able to have better organized the supply chain on this issue. Let's move very briefly, because I want to make, again, I give you plenty of time for questions, kind of current state of play. In terms of getting out funds, a lot of the dollars have started to go out on the direct deposit for folks who make less than 75 grand, or the $1,200 or up to 100 grand. The potential for those funds going out, the direct deposit funds have gone out. I think the IRS and the government will be trying to solicit others to kind of get your check in the mail. Again, I think it's fairly outrageous that the president's tried to put his name on those checks, but I guess we shouldn't be surprised at that. On the unemployment, where two good things there. One, we've dramatically expanded unemployment to cover a host of people that were not traditionally covered in Virginia. We have less than 50% of the workforce are normally covered by unemployment. So the fact that we're now expanding it to gig workers, independent contractors, something again that Milan worked with me on when we worked together, I think was a huge step in the right direction. But as we know, even though we've expanded the universe and also increased the dollar amount by $600 a week, both good things, getting these funds out through a fairly antiquated system, and not just in Virginia, but across the country, is proving to be a challenge. And then finally, the program that is probably the most, that's attracted the most attention, and that's the PPP program. And while I'm supportive of the program, and I know we're going to replenish it shortly, let me point out some of the issues there. I think on PPP, the fact that when this program was designed, there was not a requirement to actually show economic harm, means that I think we're going to hear an awful lot of stories of businesses, not just the Ruth Chris's or the Shake Shacks, who may have had the capital to withstand this, but oftentimes I know friends in money management and elsewhere who kind of got to the front of the list, and they candidly have not shown the level of economic duress that I think would be appropriate. And on the other end, we have this circumstance, we've gone through the $349 billion. My fear is that most of the businesses have gotten that, even if you say only a certain number have gotten it inappropriately, that we're really not getting the full universe of people. There were 1.7 million of these loans/grants given out. There are over 11 million businesses under 500 people in America. So there's enormous mismatch there. And that 11 million doesn't count all of the charitable organizations that are in our country, religious organizations that all could qualify for these funds. So I think that, we know the problem. A lot of these smaller entities, the barbershop, the beauty salon, does not have a firm banking relationship. And so what the Democrats did at the federal level, as there was an attempt to replenish this program, we've said, hold on, we'll replenish it, but let's also make sure that we make sure that minority-owned businesses, really small businesses, micro businesses can get some level of a set aside, so that even if you don't have a great banking relationship and you've got a 3-person barbershop, you're not going to be excluded. And my hope is that that deal will be announced today. It will also include money for hospitals. It will also include money for the emergency grant program that's out of SBA. And again, hopefully some additional funds for testing. So my hope is that program will be replenished, but it needs to be done in a much more efficient way. Final comment, again, to make sure we've got time for plenty of questions, is, I've been thinking for the last couple of weeks, as well-intentioned as all of these programs are, the expansion of unemployment, the PPP program, the emergency disaster loan program, that maybe this effort is not going to be big enough. I mean, unfortunately, what we've seen is, we've done a pretty good job of taking care of the airlines, who obviously have been hit, and we've done a decent job of taking care of businesses under 500. What about those middle market firms? What about that firm that's 700 people? They have no place to look. And as we look at 22 million Americans unemployed, and that, and that breaking of the employer-employee relationship, which means when we do reopen, it's going to even be harder to reconnect. And the number of people who are losing their health insurance through going on unemployment really has made me rethink whether we should, as we move to the next coronavirus package, and we get a little more visibility about how long this decline may be, that maybe it's time to rethink and reboot in a major way. So I've been looking at what the European countries have done. I've been looking at some of the thinking in our country. From the Republican side, Josh Hawley, a senator from Missouri, has got an approach that says, let's go out and just fund everybody's payroll directly. Pramila from Washington State, is a House member, is a chairman of the Progressive Caucus, has got a proposal that's very generous, more to the left and progressive. I actually worked with Bernie Sanders and Doug Jones and Dick Blumenthal, and have come out with a plan that we unveiled Friday night. It's not gotten a lot of popular media pickup, but a lot in kind of intellectual amongst think tanks that would say maybe we should go ahead and just not sever the employer-employee relationship, and literally fund directly payrolls from the federal government, straight to payroll processors, so that people, would have a choice of coming back from unemployment, getting back on their payroll, and in a way that I'd commend you to look at. We've got, I think, a pretty good think paper out there. A lot of problems with it still. I could, if we get into questions there, I can point out the problems in this as well. But it may be a time to rethink this. And one of the things I would point out is that we've really gotten a lot of think tank, at least, approval from folks on the AFL has endorsed our approach. People at the Roosevelt Institute have endorsed our approach. But we've also got interest from folks like American Enterprise Institute and a number of folks on the center right. So again, if people have got a little extra time, it's called the Paycheck Security Act. I think it's Paycheck Security Act. But you can again go on my site, and we'd be happy to share information. And I'd love to get your comments as well. So that was a little bit too long, Milan, for me on opening. But let's go ahead and move to questions. And again, I thank all my friends at DemBiz for being willing to participate today.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I thought that was an excellent overview. And actually, I want to start with that last point, that legislation that you talked about. I think it's very impressive that you've spanned sort of the ideological spectrum on that, getting Bernie Sanders on board with an idea that also many Republican groups support, and seems to be a really intelligent way that a number of European countries like Denmark have tried to ensure that people don't lose their benefits by keeping them on the payroll. Mm-hmm. Also making sure that when we ramp back up, that it's not difficult for businesses to find the appropriate worker support and employees. And so how realistic do you think it is that Mitch McConnell will support an idea like this and whatever future packages we have coming through?
Well, Milan, that's a great question. I mean, especially as we replenish the bucket right now on the PPP program, I do think there is a growing recognition that let's take all the universe of businesses that are between 500 employees and 10,000 employees. They may not be large enough to be able to go in the commercial paper market. So they don't have, corporate bonds that the Fed can buy. And the Fed Main Street facility, which I was involved in trying to help set up, candidly, I don't think has been generous enough. I mean, it's not even super low interest loans. And for many of these businesses, if they've been shut down, taking 3 or 4% money at this point, it's just not a viable item. So I think there's a recognition that what we've set up is not extensive enough. I do think there are a number of Republicans, not just Josh Hawley, who are interested in this idea. But let me make clear, it is not a silver bullet. I mean, the way we've set up our approach is to say that, if a business was 50% in decline and they've laid off 50% of the workforce, the only people that can participate in this would be people that you've actually furloughed, and ask them to come back. We wouldn't force anybody to come back. If somebody would rather be on unemployment, they can be that, or if they've moved on, they can do that. But you would have to bring people back from furlough to put them back on your payroll. There is a challenge on that. Let me point out one of the problems with our approach, and I hear this, for example, from the aerospace industry, where businesses have kept their employees. They want to keep their employees, but they've gone without income for a long time. If we implemented our program, you'd almost have, and this is a real flaw, you'd almost have to technically lay off your people and then bring them back. And how we grapple with businesses that still have some income, so you don't subsidize the people who are still getting appropriately paid, is still a problem with ours. And one of the things I think we have to acknowledge, and I think the value of keeping the workers connected to the employer is a good idea, but there are going to be a lot of businesses that will come out of this crisis fundamentally changed. And a business may have 100 people today. It may reemerge at 60 people and still be a successful business, but that's just going to be its new business model. So what do you do with those workers, even if you've maintained all 100 during the crisis? How do you get into the new reality? So I think there are questions to be answered. I think there is a growing recognition, though, that as well-intentioned as what we've tried to do, it's leaving wide swaths of the economy out. And as you mentioned, Milan, in Europe, you're not seeing the same kind of ballooning unemployment numbers that we've seen here. Now, again, in Europe, they don't have a traditional unemployment system that's as robust as ours. So will this become law? Time will tell. I think it's worthy of debate. And I think there is what I've been surprised, and I won't, since we're recording, I won't call out, I won't mention all the folks, but the number of people from left to right that at least would say, we probably should have done what the Europeans done and not set up all these complicated, different, separate efforts to help folks out.
Very fair. As you can imagine, we've had a number of questions come in about PPP. And so you mentioned the Ruth's Chris issue and bigger companies actually getting access at the detriment of smaller ones in this first tranche. So Michael Amuri from Vienna asks, why were large corporations like Potbelly's and Ruth's Chris able to get these loans, draining the pot for small businesses? Is there anything that you're going to be doing in the next round? I think you mentioned a little bit about that. And then I'll add on one, which is this morning, Bloomberg has an article that talks about the differences between red states and blue states in receiving PPP loans. And no surprise, red states are getting the majority of the funding. Is there anything that Congress can do, or are you guys working on anything in terms of oversight to make sure that it's not just going to the states that are critical to the president's reelection?
Yeah, great questions. On the question of the Ruth Chris's and the Potbellies and so forth, I mean, there was, and I was not involved in this part of the negotiation, there was an agreement that even kind of franchisees of whether they be restaurants or of hotels, oftentimes, you may have 10 different Marriott hotels. They're all owned individually, and Marriott is just the management company. And oftentimes the same case with the restaurants. So they've, in a sense, they got under the 500 rule because the affiliation rules that normally take place didn't rise up. So there was an exemption for hotels and restaurants. The challenge with that has been the restaurants that have got the brand names usually have got the better banking relationships. So they got the money, and the local hot dog shack that maybe didn't have the banking relationship didn't get the funds. I think that was a mistake. I also think there are businesses, unfortunately, that receive funds through the PPP program that really, since there was no indication of how much loss you had to show, in the proposal I put out on Friday, I wanted to show at least 20% revenue loss. I'm familiar, unfortunately, with people I know who are in money management or in stock management, and they've not had any significant loss at all, and they were able to get funds on that. I think there'll be a great pushback. I've expressed concern from day one. I'm on the record on this. I've talked to the Treasury Secretary about it, and I'm not sure how we're going to completely clean that up. The only thing I think we can do is, in this next refilling of the bucket, make sure that we actually set aside certain amount of funds for really these micro businesses, for the kind of non-banked business. And again, I'm not being totally critical of the banks. If you've got you're a community bank and you've got 2,000 loan applications coming in and 1,000 of them are customers, you're going to use your customers first. And I think that proved to be the case. I've heard about the Bloomberg story. I want to look at it. I hope that is not the case, that red states are doing better. I mean, one thing I have, and I know we're on DemBiz and we're all good Democrats here, but I actually have found the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, to be I think a fair bargainer. I mean, we don't always agree, but we've been in, I think he's been trying to do this on the up and up. I want to look at the Bloomberg story before I fully comment on that. I would think there might be, just in some of the states that may have smaller populations, you may have a broader community bank network, so more businesses might been able to get funneled in. There were a large number, I think, of the grants that went out to community banks. I think it was like 24% of 25% of the loans went to banks under $10 billion. Milan, sounds like a lot, but that's a relatively small bank. 75% of the 75, I think almost 80% of the loans were 350,000 and less. So that's good that we're getting it out to smaller numbers, but that only accounted for roughly, I don't have all the numbers here, but roughly 28%, I think, of the money. So a huge percentage of the money, of the 350 billion, was going to those larger businesses, closer to 400 to 500, at the full $10 million a pop. And I think that's, again, was not our full intent.
Okay.
So that's a little bit of a rambly answer. I apologize. And, let me look again at the Bloomberg stuff, and maybe I can post something on that later.
Okay, that would be great. We have Michael Cook asks, what are we looking at in terms of additional aid to states and local governments?
Well, Michael, great question. I hope you're well. We put $150 billion in the CARES package, or we call that package number 3, and that 150 billion ended up being about 3.2 billion to Virginia. The challenge is it's probably not enough. I mean, when we think about the losses at the local government level, when we think about the state revenue declines, and I am very afraid that we're going to start to see local governments, and I think this is already happening. I think the mayor of Los Angeles has already indicated this, that they're starting to furlough people. And we wanted to put more money in for state and local government in this 3.5 package. Our Republican colleagues didn't. Frankly, I think it's the stuff that makes people go crazy on. We, of course, are going to have to put more money into state and local governments. And it's, I think the Republicans wanted to give on certain things like hospitals, and, it was a back and forth that I wish this negotiation had been done much quicker. We're going to have to come back and do more for local governments. and state governments, and the sooner we do it, the better. I'm disappointed that it appears this what we're calling 3.5 deal won't include those funds.
You mentioned gig workers and some of the issues related to gig benefits in your opening remarks. Jane Materna from Fairfax asked a couple questions related to benefits for gig workers. So she asked, can you consider integrating or implementing portable benefits, capacity for retraining or uptraining for current gig workers, and making it easy for non-full-time employees to get mortgages as part of the COVID-19 response legislation?
Well, great question. One of the things that we've been working on separate from this was dealing with Fannie and Freddie, and I'm going to need again to post a full answer to allow for gig workers who've got obviously uneven employment, uneven income stream usually, and since they don't have a kind of traditional W-2 format to still qualify for a loan. We've made some progress on that. I want to be specific. So let me try to post that, number one. That was even before the Corona-19 virus. Number two, we obviously in this bill, I pushed for very hard, expanded unemployment to cover gig workers. Now, implementation on that for the unemployment is still a challenge because the state systems are frankly not set up for that. We was on the call with the governor again last week. And I think Megan Healy, the governor's chief workforce officer, is saying they think that will, on gig workers for Virginia, unemployment is going to start kicking in, I think this week. I've got number three, I've got legislation that would take that I'll be introducing very shortly with some colleagues in the House that will take our existing idea of having gig worker benefits become portable and dramatically fund that, with $500 million. We've, to try some experiments. Let's not retreat from this issue of if we cover people on unemployment right now, let's see if there are other benefits we can give gig workers, and can we again make them portable so you can, if you have some social insurance, can it move from one gig to another and one platform to another? And then finally, I think coming out of this crisis, the idea of worker retraining is going to be one of the most important issues we face. And this is an area that I've been spending a ton of time on. And I need to spend more on, but I think the big conceptual idea here is to fundamentally reclassify business investment in human beings. I want to do something radical like what happened in the late 70s when there was the creation of the R&D tax credit. Research and development at that point was hard to be viewed as an asset class. We were able to make it happen, and it drove a lot of the innovation in our economy. I want to make sure that training, investment in human capital is treated tax and accounting-wise the same way that investment in research and development is. And we've been talking with the SEC about this. We've been talking about a lot of additional tax credits for retraining. We've also even been talking to the accounting world about classifying investment in human beings as an asset class. Final comment I want to make here is the example that kind of brings this home, and I sometimes geek out on this stuff too much, is if a company right now goes out and buys a robot for $5,000, they get an R&D tax credit for the robot. The robot counts as an asset. You can put it on your balance sheet, and you can report on it in your public your annual report, and it adds value to your firm. If you spend $5,000 training two human beings to be more efficient than the robot, you don't get any of that tax treatment. That money that's spent on the employees is viewed as an expense. The people aren't viewed as assets. It's just totally turned on its head. This needs to fundamentally reverse itself. And I actually believe this transformational change may be one of the good things that will come out of this virus, because I think it would really accelerate the idea that investing in human beings has to be a higher priority. And clearly, I think there will be some bipartisan support for that.
Yeah, unquestionably, you've been the leader on this issue, and I hope that if there's anything good that comes out of this crisis, it will be solutions like that. Sunny Abbasi asks, he starts out by thanking you for your leadership on mortgage matters and asks, what's going on with respect to support for mortgage servicers? You led a letter with 7 senators on this, but the regulator, Mark Calabria, has been very reluctant to take any measures that will prop up, the servicers who are in danger of failing after the FHFA itself required Fannie and Freddie to offer mortgage forbearance to millions of Americans.
Right, and Milan, I know, and Sonny, it's great to hear from you, and he's a great friend, and this was an area that Milan knows tons about. For those of you who are not mortgage geeks on the Zoom call today, I think we all agreed it was appropriate to let people forbear their mortgage if they had to. But if you forbear your mortgage, you pay it to a mortgage servicer. And there are oftentimes 2 types of mortgage servicers. Some may be banks, and a bank could actually still go to the Fed window and borrow additional money at 0 to no cost, because you still have to then pay the investors, because you've taken these packages of mortgages, packaged them together, sold them off to investors. A bank can still qualify for that. But a lot of mortgages, you think about mortgages that are originated on some of the big platforms like Quicken Loans, but there's a number of smaller platforms like the ones that Sonny works for, and lots of mortgage bankers, all over the country, who've been originating, packaging together these mortgages. And their job is not only to originate, but then to service, make sure you continue to pay your mortgage and maintain the mortgage. But if suddenly you've got not 5 or 8 or 9% of people forbearing, but you've got 20, 30, 40, you still have to pay upstream. The more independent mortgage bankers have to pay those bills to the investors, because the investors still said, hey, not my problem. I bought this security. Where's my money? And what we've been, and you're right, Mark Calabria, who runs FHFA, has not been very sympathetic, because there were some of these mortgage bankers who've been overextended. But my fear is, you could have never expected this kind of dramatic event. And if you suddenly took all the independent mortgage bankers and 30% of them all go bankrupt at once, the disruption that could take in the whole housing market would be hugely, hugely significant. And to answer Sonny's question directly, I've had conversations with Jay Powell. I think he appreciated our letter. He was very complimentary of it. And the challenge here, and this is I think pretty significant, is that I don't think they want to bail out all mortgage bankers, but the idea that because certain mortgage bankers might be over leveraged, that we should allow this level of disruption to take place in the mortgage servicing industry. To penalize a few guys that were over leveraged is, in my mind, not worth the risk of fundamental disruption in the whole housing market if this were to all take place in a very short period of time. So I am cautiously optimistic that we may see some relief in this field, I hope very shortly.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn a little bit to some foreign policy related questions that we received. Catherine Tobin in Alexandria asks, what is your opinion on China's responsibility vis-a-vis acting responsibly to the world? To what extent do you believe they have culpability? How do we manage and realign our US-China relationship going forward?
Well, let me start by saying that I don't trust the Communist Party in China. I don't trust President Xi Jinping, and I think they have not been transparent. But I think we have to be, a couple of comments here. One, very careful when we talk about this. I think it's outrageous that the president has tried to shift the whole blame to China, that he wouldn't have us sign on to G7 accords because we wanted to call it the Wuhan virus. And I am very, very concerned that this kind of almost xenophobia that's coming out of the administration could lead to bias against all of China or the Chinese people, or more specifically Chinese Americans. The level of prejudicial actions. I've been meeting with the Chinese American community on a regular basis, and the volume of racial slurs and epithets going on out there has gone up enormously. That being said, I think that China was not forthcoming enough. I wish China would have invited more international scientists beyond just the WHO in early on. I've had some grave concerns, as many who follow this know, about particularly the Chinese tech companies and how they are being manipulated by the Chinese government and are, in a sense, agents of the Communist Party. On the other hand, some friends of mine who were connected with Alibaba, were saying, hey, we're willing to help on PPE. At first, I was unwilling to kind of take that offer up. Then I heard that Andrew Cuomo got 7 million masks through Alibaba, and I said, well, so I've connected them with Virginia, and I think some of those contacts have been helpful in terms of Virginia securing PPE. And the one country that has now got the capacity to export this is China. So I think, as we move past this virus, I think we're going to need real serious conversations about what is international security interest in terms of supply chain. I do not think we should, be a year from now and not have domestic PPE manufacturing capability in this country. I don't think we should be continuing to source 70 to 80% of the compounds and basic materials that go into our drugs from China. I think that is just because it's cheaper, just because it may be a nickel cheaper. I think sourcing on things around healthcare and to have domestic supplies going forward is something that's going to be a high priority for me, and frankly, I think a high bipartisan priority.
Thank you. John Iovas asks, what are you doing? What can you do to keep the United States funding flowing to the WHO in this critical time around the world, especially for poor countries that are ravaged by this pandemic and other tragedies like epidemics and diseases?
Well, John, my hope is that we will, replenish the funding, and the idea that the president can arbitrarily cut this off, as we've seen a number of times. The president sometimes says these things and isn't able to fully carry through. I would hope that the vast majority of us in both parties would still realize the WHO is an important organization. If there are flaws, we ought to correct them. And there probably were some flaws vis-a-vis China, but to suddenly say we're going to get rid of this organization that has been fairly effective in past outbreaks, I think would be extraordinarily short-sighted. Let me just make, John, one other comment here. This virus is one more example of what happens when there's not strong American leadership. If we think back to 9/11, if we think back to the financial crisis, if we think back to SARS and Ebola and elsewhere, you really did need strong American leadership that the rest of the world looks to. And as America retreats under this president, you either give an opportunity for China to come in. Although, the Chinese government brings certain values that are, frankly, I don't think going to be all that welcome in much of the world. But it also means that without strong American leadership, I think the rest of the world fumbles around a bit. And, not just WHO, I just think that the fact that there does not seem to be a group convening best practices from around the world, what is Germany and South Korea and others doing that we could learn from in a real-time way? I think that's not happening now the way it would have in previous crises. Doesn't matter, Democrat or Republican presidents, because I think this president walks away from that kind of world leadership.
So as you can imagine, we got a number of questions about election interference in Russia. So I'm going to try to consolidate some of those questions. And have one here from Jim Edmondson on Senator Burr. So how would Senator Warner characterize his relationship with Senator Burr, both with respect to intelligence issues and with regard to the suppression of votes in Republican states? Burr seems to be rational about the former, but is he just another typical Republican claiming voter fraud is rampant on the latter? Is he persuadable to vote for mail-in voting? And is Mitch McConnell, how amenable is Mitch McConnell to working on these issues, or is he going to block them for partisan gain?
Well, Jim, a couple of things. I still have a very strong working relationship with Richard Burr. There are obviously areas that he and I very strongly disagree. I have not heard him, go off on some of the tangents. Maybe he has. I don't know his whole record on voter fraud that some of my other Republican colleagues have. On the issue of vote by mail, one of the things we in Virginia have and I strongly endorse. Let me step back and say I strongly endorse the Klobuchar-Wyden bill that would move us all towards vote by mail across the country. In Virginia, we've done about 80% of that already, and kudos to the legislature and the governor for supporting those efforts. We don't go as far as forcing everybody to be sent a ballot the way some states have, but we have put in place no excuse absentee voting. We put in place 20 days of voting in Virginia before the polling stations. I don't think the question about McConnell, if there's one thing that Mitch McConnell really seems to care about, it is voting, not having anything in terms of voting reform and not having anything in terms of campaign finance reform. You take that, combine it with Trump's views on vote by mail, and I don't think we're going to get complete vote by mail for this fall. I do think we will get additional resources, and I think we will see other states push towards, again, more liberalized, no excuse absentee voting. So I think that's a step in the right direction. One of the things, and Amy Klobuchar, my friend, knows, has gotten into this issue much more than I and has learned a lot more than I. She points out that, even if you had a completely supportive Senate and president, you couldn't move the whole country to vote by mail by this year. You'd have to have some variations, and that actually many of the civil rights organizations want to maintain election day voting. They want to add to it additional absentee, but they don't want to do away with election day voting. So I think we'll make progress. I think we'll get some more resources. I'm not sure we're going to see the whole Klobuchar-Wyden bill actually fully implemented though.
And then as a follow-up on that, what type of measures do you think are realistic this year in terms of election security to prevent countries like Russia from manipulating our elections? And also, you've been the leader on sort of addressing the manipulation of sort of the big tech platforms in aiding some of that nefarious activity. Any progress on that front?
Yeah, I think there's progress. I think there is a recognition now, even from the reddest of red state secretaries of state, that Russians and others did manipulate and are still trying to manipulate this election. So that's progress. I think we put additional funds out there. Each of these bills, this last bill was $400 million. I think it was $280 the bill before that. So we are getting some more resources out. Number three, the intelligence community has made election security a high priority. And whether we're talking about the Director of National Intelligence Office or NSA, CIA, there are lots of folks working on election security. And I think, generally speaking, the tech platforms have gotten better. That's the good news. The bad news is, inside this administration, and I've got an op-ed that I think will appear in the Washington Post in the next day or two, that really points out the fact that this president is completely undermining the independence of the intelligence community. I am horribly afraid that people are afraid to speak truth to power. This president has basically eliminated any Senate-approved official in the Director of National Intelligence Office. That is a grave concern to me, and not just me. I'm talking with lots of folks who are part of the intelligence community, retired, and many of them who work for this president, who are gravely concerned about that integrity. And let's face it, in many ways, I think Admiral McGuire was fired as the acting Director of National Intelligence because he sent up people that told the truth about what Russians are doing this election cycle. So we ought to be scared. I am extraordinarily worried about that. And then we still have on the tech platforms, I don't think enough. I still, I talk to Mark Zuckerberg on a fairly regular basis. I'm still deeply disturbed. And I've been very straight up with him on this, that the Facebook policy that allows a politician to lie in a campaign ad, and the fact that Facebook feels no content responsibility for a blatantly false lie, I think is an awful, awful policy. Because I think you can go out, Mark Warner could lie or Donald Trump could lie in a campaign ad, and then that ad could be promoted by millions of foreign bots that would take that message out everywhere. I am gravely concerned about that. I'm gravely concerned about, within some of the Facebook group chats, the increasing use of encryption. Facebook is trying to do a little bit better, not being, to be able to have not so many 1 to, 1 million people kind of encrypted messages. But this is a huge area of concern. And again, when we as those of you who heard me before, one of the reasons we know that Facebook or that Russia will be back is that, this is so cheap on a relative basis. And Putin's goal is disruption in our country. And what better time to try to do that when people are focused on something else like the COVID disease.
Thank you. Jennifer O asks, what efforts are being made to get unsold crops meant for restaurant clients to food banks? Why can't farmers be compensated for continuing the harvest and getting them to folks in need?
Oh, Jennifer, man, oh man, great question. Amen. And I was talking to like the #2 guy at Walmart recently and saying, can't we redirect the supply chain, from food that used to go to restaurants, have it now go to food banks or elsewhere? Because, traditionally where the food banks get their money is from grocery stores, but now there's not excess supply at grocery stores because everybody's shopping there. So let me give you 2 or 3 comments. One, one of the things Lisa and I've done personally is I've given donations to all the central food banks, 7 of them around Virginia. Number 2, Jose Andres, who many of us in the greater Washington area know, has got this World Central Kitchen that is literally, and through their Chefs for America, I think the program is called, they are paying chefs to keep their restaurants open to feed frontline responders, in a very efficient manner. And I would commend anyone to look up what Jose's doing. I think he was on 60 Minutes again last night. He's a remarkable human being, and everybody's a little bit fiscally, or not everybody's got financial resources now, but I think Jose's program would be a good one to contribute to. And I'm trying to see if in the next bill we could take Jose's ideas and take them out to scale. Jennifer, I've not, we're still producing enough food, but the idea of farmers plowing this food under, and then people waiting, hours and hours on end at food banks that are being exhausted is just crazy to me. And I do think we're going to need federal support here. There is, USDA. We've got in Virginia, for example, Tim Kaine and I have asked for USDA to approve for folks on food stamps, delivery. So there are things we can do around the edges, but this massive switch in supply chain, I'm trying, but I've not had a good answer yet why we can't shift at least 50% of the food that used to go to restaurants, shift that into people who are in great need at this point. So again, a fairly rambly answer, and I'd like to have a better answer, but I am working on it. In the meantime, I'm trying to do all I can personally to support food banks and support programs like Jose's.
Wonderful, thank you for that. I think we'll do 2 or 3 more questions, and we want to be very cognizant of your time. So Kanin Srinivasan from Loudon asks, is there any opportunity to have a public-private partnership to scale up testing for COVID-19?
The answer is I'm not 100% sure. I know, the number we're talking about is $25 billion more into testing um, in this new bill. So that would be obviously public money that would supplement private private efforts in terms of new tests. The thing where I'm working the most is actually with Johns Hopkins University, because Hopkins, as probably most of you know, has become the definitive source for the spread of the virus. So most of the public newspapers, they're not citing CDC data, they're citing Hopkins data. So I've been engaging with Hopkins and saying, can you guys, and they were going to do this already, and I'm trying to help get them state support and pharma support and financial support. Can you create a single site that says by jurisdiction, where the tests are being performed, what are the source of tests, what's in the FDA pipeline? We should have this information out there in a transparent way. The government should do it in a rational world. It doesn't appear the government's doing it. I'm not sure the administration really wants transparency on testing, but if we can get Hopkins to do that, and if we could also know kind of what's in the pipeline, then as policymakers, we can say, well, maybe we ought to support more of this Pfizer program or this, Burroughs Wellcome program. But we don't have that information. It should be out there. My hope is that we should have an announcement from Hopkins, I hope within another week.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. I want to go back to some of the Fed facilities that you mentioned in your early remarks. And you mentioned the Main Street Lending Program. I don't think that most people know publicly what a critical role you played in helping get that money in the CARES Act. I know because I had the opportunity to see some of the early drafts, and I really think you more than anyone else really drove through that money for the ESF so that the Fed could then go out and lend to small and medium-sized businesses. There has been a little bit of criticism of the narrowness. You addressed that earlier in the Fed and how conservative they're being in designing these programs. Similarly, there are a number of other Fed facilities that have been set up to support businesses. One of them is the TALF program that's being run by the New York Fed Term Asset Lending Facility, where businesses can or investors can pledge asset-backed securities and then receive liquidity to go out and make additional loans. But I'll raise two data points with you and see if there's anything that the Congress can do to push the Fed on this front. One is they don't accept asset-backed securities for personal consumer loans. And so the New York Fed's own data shows that 3 out of 10 small businesses take out personal loans because they're micro businesses to be able to fund the businesses. And there are AAA rated, AA rated, single A rated, investment grade securities out there for personal consumer loans, but the New York Fed is not accepting this as collateral. Now, part of the reason I think for that is that the New York Fed has copied and pasted the 2008 playbook verbatim, and personal consumer loans didn't really exist in the way that they exist today. So today there are $160 billion worth of those securities out there, and yet they're not eligible under the New York Fed's criteria currently. And the concern there is that if they don't accept that as eligible collateral, then lenders won't turn around and lend to individuals who won't be able to fund their micro businesses. So that's one concern. Similar vein, they're not taking residential mortgage-backed securities, non-agency RMBS. Similarly, a number of small businesses tap into those home equity lines. And if they're not accepting that as collateral, but they're taking actually much worse off commercial backed mortgages, there's a disconnect. So I don't know if you've given any thought to that, or Congress is given us.
Well, I'm not going to get into the particulars because only you and I would probably nerd out on this stuff. And I'm sure most of the other DemBiz participants are going, there goes Milan off in the weeds again. But, and I think the bigger question is, and I remember having a conversation with Jay Powell at the beginning of this process. Jay believes, the Fed's responsibility here is not to do fiscal policy. They think they need to just in a sense, under what's called the 13-3 facility, not take any risk. So, the reason why he's got this $4 trillion facility is because of the $2.2 trillion that we just did in CARES, $425 billion was set aside, and that's leverage 10-1. So all these facilities do have like a dollar of Treasury money and $9 of Fed money, and that's supposed to take care of the losses. I think, and I want to be generally complimentary of the Chairman Powell. I think he's been pretty aggressive, but I do think we either need to up the Treasury amount, because if not, I think the Fed's normal tendency to be conservative isn't going to have us, meet the match. I think the Main Street facility is well intentioned, but the Main Street facility under the 13.3, the loans are actually more expensive than even commercial loans. So who's going to even use this facility? We had put in the law that they'd have to offer loans at 2%, not that 3.75, which they're talking about. They need to follow the law on the 2%. They've not done that so much. I'm keeping pressure on, but it's this inability of the Fed to get money to all these places. That's one of the reasons that drove me to do this proposal with Senator Sanders that said, let's just do direct deposit using the payroll processors straight into the payrolls of businesses who are at risk.
Thank you. Last question. This is an election year, and certainly COVID-19 has kept everybody at home. Hopefully folks are safely sheltering in place, but very disruptive to a traditional campaign. How do you plan to get your message out this year? And also, what reforms are you making in terms of the campaign apparatus to make sure that you're reelected and you can continue fighting for Virginians?
Well, thank you, Milan. And since this is a kind of quasi-campaign to DemBiz, I can, I'm still got an active campaign. I'm still fundraising. If anybody has the wherewithal or interest, our operation has had revenue hits as everybody else. I mean, we lost the last half of March, which we were going to do our announcement campaign. We've had probably 40 fundraisers come off the books. We're doing some of these fundraisers this way on Zoom. We're trying to do 20 to 25 people in a fundraiser where everybody gets guaranteed a question. In the meantime, what I'm trying to do is much more social media. I try to do a lot of Facebook Lives. I'm trying to find other ways to contact people. I'm anxious to get out and do old-fashioned campaigning. I don't know how soon people are going to want to be shaking my hand every month. I think about all the parades I would do where I run up the parade route and probably sweat too much, and I'm not sure people are going to be grasping my sweaty hand anytime soon. So we are going to have to think differently. I mean, it's challenging us. I've kept everybody on my campaign, full pay, full engagement. We've still got lots of work to do. So my hope is that people will respond and that they will appreciate the fact that I'm working my tail off trying to make sure that we get Virginia and our country through this. And I'm very appreciative as that is the last question, and hope that people will check out my campaign website. Love to have you volunteer. Love to have you be able to contribute. We're doing virtual potluck suppers. We're trying every way we possibly can to get our message out. But first and foremost, I think right now is what takes much more precedence for me over the campaign at this point is doing my job as senator, trying to make sure I get the Virginians, whether they support me or not, to know what kind of assistance is coming, what we can do to make some of these programs better. And then finally, I think one of the things we need to do, and this will be my last comment, is just we need to be a little more graceful to each other. We need to grant each other a little bit of grace at this period of time. This is the hardest thing probably for most of us that we've ever gone through, whether it's being cooped up or fear for your loved ones who might not be able to be sheltering in place, uncertainty about what the future holds. So I do hope, even if we have political differences or other kind of differences, that we can cut each other a little bit of a break. And I would ask and encourage all of you, to, if you've got a friend, a neighbor, a relative that you've not talked to, reach out to him or her. So many of us are feeling fairly isolated during these times. I actually feel I probably get more stimulus now during these days than I get in a normal day on the Hill. But I really do think reaching out and telling somebody you care about them is so important at this point. And on that note, to all my friends in DemBiz, thank you all for hanging in, and I will see you along the trail.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us, taking time out of your busy schedule this morning. One last plug for DemBiz. If you have enjoyed our programming this morning, we are doing a number of free Zoom teletown halls. Our next one is coming up this Friday with Chris Liu, former Deputy Labor Secretary under President Obama, and look forward to having all of you join us there. Senator Warner, thank you so much,
Thank you,
and keep
Milan.
up the great work.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Be safe.